Hello, my name is Brian Brown, and I'm very excited to share my presentation with you today as part of the Salt Lake County Watershed Symposium 2020. So thank you very much for joining me for this virtual presentation. And I'll jump right into it. Today I'm sharing a conversation about a simple framework for describing Streamflow regime. As part of a much larger team of international researchers who have worked very diligently for the last 2 years to assemble one of the first global data sets of Streamflow. So data sets about Streamflow have existed on a regional to countrywide or even continent-wide scale for some time. But this is really the first of its kind that has brought together a global scope. So I'm a master's student at Brigham Young University, and I was brought into the project after that had already happened. And so the majority of the credit for the development of this data set, all of the credit for the development of this data set goes to my collaborators. And what I'll be presenting to you here today are some really fun data science approaches that I've taken to this data set to try and bring some sense to it, and try and bring it to the real world and kind of help us understand what it means, what the implications of it are. And I'll start out by building some expectations about why we might care about streams. So there's a human-centered approach, and there's more of an environment-centered approach. And just thinking about basic human needs, human society has clung to fresh water through history, almost like barnacles have on boats. It's just we can't exist on any other substrate than arable land and clean fresh water that's readily available. And the presence or absence of water have been part of natural disasters that have been stuck in our history, even from our cultural records. You know, you think about from the flood of Noah to the droughts in Egypt that allowed Joseph of Egypt to gain power with Potiphar from the stories in the Bible. You know, just in our own Western culture, these concepts of the presence or absence of water have stuck with us through time. From an environmental perspective, streams and lakes are biodiversity hotspots. They comprise a very small percentage of the landmass, or cover a small percentage of landmass, but a huge percentage, a much larger percentage than you expect from just raw averages of biodiversity is attributed to streams and to lakes. So they're biodiversity hotspots. They're also really, really powerful windows into biogeochemical cycles. Now just imagine with me, if you will, try to think up some mechanism for studying a whole mountainside or whole streams or whole hillside, and try to understand what's the sum effect of all the biogeochemical cycles that are occurring in that stream, or not in that stream, I keep saying stream, in that mountainside. And it's hard to think of a better integrator than rainwater. Think about rainwater moving through a hillside. It picks up all the byproducts of those biogeochemical processes as it moves through, and it integrates those and puts them into a stream. And granted, they're altered by processes within the stream itself, but it's for this reason that integrating capacity that they have, that my advisor Ben Abbott's likes to describe streams as urine samples for an environment, for a hillside, for a drainage basin. So lots of different ways of looking at streams and thinking about their importance. There's the human-centered aspect. There's the fact that they're in ecosystems in and of themselves. But there's also the fact that they tell us a lot about the health of their surrounding ecosystems. I really enjoy talking with experts from different domains, everything from people who study decomposition to sociology, microbial decomposition to sociology. And when I talk with experts from each of these domains, I kind of get the sense that they're willing to bet that it's probably their organism, their type of organism, that's really in charge of the majesty and dynamics, the interesting things that we see in nature. And you can make a convincing case for all of them. And I don't claim to be so smart as to really know what the answer is, if there's one driving factor in terms of how life organizes itself. But I do think that water sometimes is overlooked in terms of its critical importance, and that no life form has ever been able to get away from this dependence on water. So just one more reason to think that streams are really important, because they're a critical source of fresh water on terrestrial ecosystems, both to humans, to microbes, to plants, and to animals. But they've remained largely unstudied compared to other types of systems. And part of that is because they're just so difficult to study. And a few of those reasons are listed here. One of the first is heterogeneity. If you know something about one stream, you don't necessarily know anything about any other stream. Each one is unique and needs to be treated like an individual. On top of that, there are a lot of individuals to think about. Everywhere you go, there are streams, even in places where it's very dry. They might be ephemeral streams, but they're there wherever we go, and they're different wherever we go. And so big data is a term that definitely applies to streams. The other very difficult thing about streams is if you know something about one stream at a given point in time, you don't necessarily know anything about that stream at any other given point in time. They do have certain dynamics that are consistent from year to year, but on a low flow year to a high flow year, they can be entirely different. On a week to week basis, they can be entirely different. And so you never step in the same stream twice, as the old saying goes. And so each stream, each measurement of a stream almost needs to be treated like its own individual. And all these facts together make studying streams kind of difficult. And it's very different from studying water as it moves through a pipe. We have pretty solid physics for understanding how water is going to move through a pipe, and that's allowed us to do some remarkable things. But just follow this thought experiment with me, if you will. You are a drop of water. Imagine yourself falling from a cloud through the sky, and you land on a plant. You land on the leaf of the little plant. And you sit there for a little minute, and you're feeling the hairs on this leaf around you, and you're kind of sinking into the leaf, and enough other droplets fall around you, and they bounce you around, and eventually, boom, you fall onto the ground. And all of a sudden, things are really different from this scale, right? You might have just landed on a rock. And as you move across this rock, you might pick up some sediments with you as you go. You might land just in between the crack of the rock and the soil, where there's a little bit of a gap, and you just slide right into it. You might land on a little twig and wrap yourself around the bark. You might land on a piece of hard, compact soil and sit on it for just a little bit before you slowly sink in. Or you might land on a piece of really, really porous soil and sink in quite quickly. The idea is that it's not simple, right? There's an enormous number of possibilities of things that can and do happen every day all around us. It's not the same thing as, just imagine with me, if you will, flowing through a pipe, right? You're stuck next to a whole bunch of other pieces of water, droplets of water. There's kind of nowhere to go but forward. Very different experience. So we understand how water moves through pipes. We don't understand how it moves through a natural ecosystem. But we can measure some things. And we most often measure things in streams in terms of time series. And one of the most common representations of a stream is a hydrograph, which is what you see depicted here, where it's the amount of flow through time. You might call it Julian day, or you might measure it on a minute by minute basis. But what you'll notice is that there are these ups and downs in the time series. We get more water someday, we get less water another day. That picture is pretty similar to the same picture that you see for pressure waves, sound waves. They're very different concepts, right? The amount of water flowing through a stream through time isn't naturally something that you might compare to pressure waves moving through the air. One, they occur on very different temporal scales, and two, they represent very different phenomena. These are, in this case, we're thinking about air molecules pushing against each other. In a hydrograph, we're thinking about there's more or there's less water. So the comparison is not natural. But just looking at those pictures, you kind of think, there's kind of something similar going on there. And it turns out that a lot of the math, a lot of the physics that we've developed to describe pressure waves is actually really good at describing these ups and downs that we see through time in streams. In pressure waves, we often think actually in terms of musical notes, if they last long enough, if the pressure wave lasts long enough. And that brings a lot of simplicity, right? If you're trained to read music, you're not trained to read pressure waves. you're trained to read notes. And what a note represents are waves. So an A represents 440 beats ups and downs per second. And a B represents some other number of ups and downs per second. And just imagine some strange scenario in which you were handed a sheet of music, but instead of all the notes for a symphony, they give you the raw pressure waves, the combined effect of all the different voices singing together. It wouldn't make any sense. But you can begin to sort of tease apart what's going on if you have it in terms of frequencies, in terms of notes. Now, coming back to hydrographs, sometimes I feel like we're looking at hydrographs in the same way as in that scenario where somebody handed you all the raw pressure waves of a symphony. But it might be a lot more intuitive to think about hydrographs in terms of notes, in terms of frequencies. And there's some very interesting mathematics that shows that you can take any time series and convert it into frequencies that become louder and softer through time. And it's almost as if the streams and the microbial processes around us were a symphony of different actors, each coming in with a different note at a different point in time. Now you might be thinking, why are you bringing math into this? This is biology. I don't want to talk about math. And I just wanted to share with you one of my favorite XKCD comics, where you've got sociologists or physiologists saying that sociology is just applied physiology, and biologists saying that, you know, or psychology is just applied biology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, down to the physicist who says, oh, no, I'm the most basic that it gets. And mathematics is really at a different level of abstraction. And because of that, it's incredibly useful at describing patterns in broad domains. And while it hasn't yet been broadly applied in ecohydrology, what I'd like to do today is make the case that it might bring a lot of simplicity to otherwise complex phenomena. And let me just make the case for why it matters. Imagine stream A on the left, where this is a hydrograph, and stream B on the right, with another hydrograph. These two streams might have identical mean flow, identical day of peak flow, identical average base flow, identical seasonality to them. But if you were a caddisfly or a bryophyte or baby fish living in one of these streams, whether or not you live in stream A or stream B, it's going to totally change your experience. So these frequency ideas, which are represented in the differences between stream A and stream B, capture really different concepts than some of these other ideas that capture more temporal ideas. But beyond hydrographs, this principle of frequency decompositions is also really useful for describing nutrients as they flow through a stream. Every element of the periodic table, either in trace or higher amounts as it flows through a stream, comes through in a time series, and that time series has waves of varying frequencies. Everything from oxygen to phosphate to nitrate, nutrients that really matter in terms of the ecosystem of the stream itself and in terms of our use of the stream. And these patterns in these time series tell us everything about how nutrients are getting into the stream. It's easy to measure them once they're there, but being able to say where they came from is kind of hard. But if you know where the variance is, if you know that the ups and downs are mostly on a day-to-day basis, or if the ups and downs are mostly on a year-to-year basis, you know the dominant mechanism that's driving the presence or absence of that nutrient. And that's the case that James Kirshner and Colin Neal make in one of their famous papers. It talks about fractal scaling of stream chemistry. And the basic idea of this paper is that a mountainside is composed of fractured pieces of soil and rock. And as nutrients move through this system, they become fractured as well. And they enter the stream in all sorts of different wavelengths, in a particular signature with what's called fractal scaling. And never mind the use of all those fancy words. What they're saying is that the frequency patterns tell you that the nutrients are coming either through the soil or through some other mechanism. Where the variance is, that's where the dominant mechanism is. And this principle has brought order to chaos in stream nutrients. It hasn't yet really been applied to stream hydrographs. Now, what I have on the left is a temporal representation of hydrographs. Instead of representing time across an axis, I've represented time through time here in this GIF, where you can see individual streams. Those are the individual lines going up and down through time. And they follow a certain kind of dynamic, and there are different dynamics for different streams. It may be surprising to learn that there are several hundred metrics that have been developed by the hydrological community to describe the dynamics that you're seeing at left. Several hundred dynamics. I make the case that nature cannot be so complex as to require hundreds of variables to describe it. In my experience, true things tend to be simple. And hopefully there's a simpler way for describing these dynamics. And so the quest begins for a unified theory of streamflow, to borrow the phraseology of Stephen Hawking, where we have hundreds of flow metrics, and we'd like to boil it down to several basic metrics that describe the most important phenomena that we see in nature. And what this working group that I've been a part of has been able to do is take some fancy math borrowed from linear algebra called dimensionality decomposition, and go from hundreds of flow metrics to several basic metrics in a process called principal components analysis. And the idea is that if you have several metrics that behave similarly to each other, you can combine them into a single metric. And so the metrics that come out of this process are agglomerate metrics that are abstract in some sense, and that they might integrate multiple ideas. And so their interpretability is significantly decreased. And you can look at what percent they rely on the different original flow metrics, but still drawing out some interpretation is a little bit unclear. And one of the interesting things that I've been able to show in this analysis is that a lot of these metrics, so they identified 7 of them, really relate back to frequency concepts. So what you see here is a graph, a figure where period length is represented on the x-axis. And so a frequency has a period, right? The amount of time that it takes the wave to go up and down. And I said that a little bit wrong. Frequency is the inverse of a period. But a wave has a frequency and a period, which are inverses of each other. So the period is represented on the x-axis. On the right side are really long waves, ups and downs that go across multiple years. On the left side, you see ups and downs in terms of the amount of flow that vary across days. And here you see the color represents a correlation between a given metric and the strength of a given frequency for all the streams globally. And what you see is that metric 1 corresponds to a certain combination of different frequency strengths. In other words, there's a very strong yearly signal that's being described by metric 1 and a very weak short-term signal described by metric 1. The majority of these metrics are describing frequency attributes or notes, but they're not just describing individual notes, they're describing combinations of notes. And so you might think of metric 1 as an A chord, metric 2 as a G chord, et cetera, where metric 2 might emphasize a little bit less some of the longer term notes, and a little bit more some of the shorter term notes than metric 1. Metric 3 definitely emphasizes short-term notes and maybe some sporadic long-term notes. Metric 4 definitely is focused on long-term notes and a few short-term frequency notes. But they're combinations. You might think of them as chords. And one of the things that we haven't been able to show thus far are what are the ecological consequences of a different chord. So different chords have different qualities to the human ear that is innately interpretable. What the consequences of a high value of metric 1 or metric 2 are ecologically is not as innately interpretable. But one of the things we've been able to show as well is that there are certain dominant frequencies, certain chords that tend to be played globally. And what you see on the right here, this top line that's kind of in the lighter color, shows the average value of frequency strengths for different periods. And because the ups and downs are so flattened by the global average, what I did is I just took the second derivative, which is what you see in this black line here, and the negative peaks correspond to those weaker peaks that you see in the original frequency strengths from around the world. And I thought it'd be fun to convert them from ups and downs through time to pressure waves, and instead of ups and downs per year, it's ups and downs per second. So you can actually hear the dominant frequencies globally. So that's what I'm going to play for you here. Let me just make sure I'm sharing computer sound. So you should be able to hear it now. You just heard these different peaks being played, being converted into beats per second. I'm not sure that's scientifically that interesting, but I think it's kind of fun. One of the things we've also been able to observe is that stream order tunes the frequencies that are played by different streams on a global scale. So whatever processes that are mediating a certain note being played by streams are controlled to some extent by stream order. They're associated with stream order. And so you might think of that as tuning a particular note within the chord to have just a slightly different quality. And again, what those consequences mean for societies and for ecosystems has yet to be determined. And that's one of the things that we're looking forward to discovering. And what tunes a stream? Well, if you do some rough averaging globally, you see that there are some streams that emphasize short-term notes, that's these green ones here. And then there's some streams that emphasize long-term notes on a yearly basis, that's those orange ones. And some streams that fall somewhere in between. And one of the few relationships that we've been able to tease out of this is that temperature is associated with whether or not a stream tends to be more short-term dominated or long-term dominated. And that's probably related to snow, which makes a lot of sense. One of the other questions is every stream singing the same song? You know, are there distinct genres within streams? Is there a jazz stream? Is there a classical stream? Is there a hip hop stream? And never mind the details of how this figure was produced, but what it shows is that there's an even smattering between genres. And so there are definitely general moods that a stream can take in terms of the notes that it's going to play, the frequencies that will be exhibited in its hydrograph. But there's an even interpolation between those averages or those types, kind of an even gradation like you would see on a rainbow. So just in summary, some key takeaways. Stream time series tend to be really complex. Frequency decompositions can bring some simplicity to that. Frequency decomposition identifies certain notes or ups and downs on a different time scale that are dominant or less dominant in a time series. The notes that are most dominant are indicative of operative processes within a system. And there are a variety of systems that are dominant throughout the world, and thus there are a variety of songs and chords. Most of these songs, just like in music, how most songs can be described by a few basic chords that get used over and over again, there are a few basic chords that tend to be used by streams around the world. But we still need to further determine the socio-ecological consequences of a given chord, in the same way that we need to understand basically what a minor chord means and what a major chord means for society, for ecology. So thank you again to my co-authors. It's the Stream Resiliency Research Coordination Network that's coordinated this effort and that's allowed me to be part of it. They're my heroes. And I'll just shout out again my advisor, Ben Abbott, pictured here on the left with his family. And just a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I'm a master's student at BYU studying with Ben Abbott. I'll graduate at the end of next summer. I come to environmental science from an undergrad in bioinformatics. So I'm a little bit new on all these biogeochemical processes and the environmental science way of thinking about things. But But what I really love doing is taking a mathematical and computational approach, which is more of what my undergrad training was in, and bringing that to ecological systems or to any kind of biological system to try and bring simplicity to otherwise complex systems. So with that, I'll thank you again for being with me for this little bit, and I'll see you at the rest of the conference. Thanks so much.